What is it you wanted me to reconcile myself to? I was born here almost 60 years ago. I'm not going to live another 60 years. You always told me it takes time. It has taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time, my nieces and my nephew's time. How much time do you want for your progress?
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Achieving Racial Equity, where national experts discuss local opportunities. This CCM CARES event is co-sponsored by the Connecticut Interlocal Risk Management Agency, or CIRMA. I'm Joe DeLong, the Executive Director of the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities. And on behalf of our CCM President, Michael Frieda, the first selectman of North Haven, we want to thank those of you who have chosen to participate in the conversation via Zoom, as well as those of you watching on the WTNH Channel 8 Facebook page, via the Connecticut News Network, or on CCM's Facebook Live. We started off our program with a short clip from James Baldwin asking how long must he wait. James Baldwin died nearly 35 years ago, but unfortunately, the question he posed remains relevant. Our panelists intend to have an honest conversation about racial inequities, and more importantly, what can be done to address those inequities in our communities. This outstanding group of national voices includes Wes Moore, the New York Times best-selling author of The Other Wes Moore. He is a decorated U.S. Army veteran, a Rhodes Scholar, and a fellow to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. He is now the CEO of Robin Hood, one of the largest anti-poverty organizations in the nation. Moore is a news contributor to various publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Huffington Post, the Baltimore Sun, the New York Times, and many others. He has also made appearances on notable programs, including Face the Nation, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, The Colbert Report, Real Time with Bill Maher. Betsy Hodges, in addition to being the former mayor of Minneapolis, was a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics and Atlantic Fellow on Race Equity. She wrote the viral op-ed for New York Times this summer as mayor of Minneapolis. I saw how white liberals block change. Hodges met with Pope Francis in July 21st of 2015 to discuss climate change and human trafficking. She was one of only 8 mayors and leaders from around the world invited to the discussion. Tim Wise has become one of the most well-known anti-racist speakers in America. He was named one of 25 visionaries who are changing the world. His most popular of his 9 books is White Like Me, which tackles his experiences with white privilege and was made into a feature-length documentary. He has trained teachers, corporate employees, nonprofit organizations, and law enforcement officers in methods for addressing and dismantling racism in their institutions. And finally, Bree Newsome Bass, an American activist, drew national attention when she removed the Confederate flag from the South Carolina Capitol building after AME Zion Baptist Church shooting killed 9 black parishioners. In recognition of her civil rights work, she was named the Root 100 and the Ebony 100, as well as the NAACP Image Award, which is the chairman's award given to individuals who demonstrate exemplary public service and use their distinct platforms to create agents of change. While we are extremely excited to hear their perspectives, we also need to hear from you, our audience. There will be a segment devoted to your questions later in the program. For those of you participating via Zoom, please submit your questions and insights throughout the evening via the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you do not see the icon, simply move your cursor over the screen and the icon will appear. Additionally, we will also monitor questions offered through Facebook's comments section in order to pose those to our panelists. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening. My very good friend, Clarence Anthony, was only 24 years old when he was first elected mayor of South Bay, Florida, a position he held from 1984 through 2008. In 1999, he served as president of the National League of Cities, and in 2013, he was named the executive director of NLC, the position he still serves in today. Clarence, Mike Frieda and I both want to thank you for being our moderator, facilitator, and perhaps at times, knowing you, maybe even a needed agitator for today's discussion. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that introduction. And let me just say thank you for your work to help us start this journey that we are on in terms of really dealing with the issue of race in America, but also specifically in Connecticut. It is courageous for you to step up and lead. And I must say, we all appreciate that. And I also appreciate the opportunity to, I'm going to say, just be a part of this conversation today. I don't know how much I'll be able to moderate this amazing group of leaders that I have here to an opportunity to talk with today. But our ultimate goal is to just share our perspective and learn from each other, and to share with you some of the tools that we have learned over the years that have helped municipal, private sector, as well as nonprofit and activist communities all over America. And those of you over 250 to 300 that's on this webinar today, you are going to be fascinated and educated at the same time by this great panel that we have. I think back, and we all say this, that this conversation really started with the social uprising and the death of George Floyd and Elijah McClain and Breonna Taylor, and I can go on and on, of Black individuals who have been murdered, in fact, by law enforcement, and really brought the attention to the devastating impact of systemic racism and institutional racism in America, and especially between the Black and brown communities. But all of us that are panelists here knows that it didn't start then. And that's something that I want to make sure I put a pin in, and that as we go through this conversation, let's explore that a little bit. But it's also the issues of inequities around education. I also think that we talk about inequities around affordability and the quality of housing, broadband. And so many of the policy issues that municipal officials, state, federal officials discuss, oftentimes we miss, Mayor, the racial impact, the implication on the people of brown and Black communities throughout, communities of color. So this may be a difficult conversation for some, if this is the beginning of their learning, their journey, but it's one that many of us have had all our lives. And it's time that we lift up this conversation even more. As my daughter tells me, when I use this word, I say, all of a sudden, America is woke. She get embarrassed when I try to pretend that I'm hip. But all of a sudden, America is woke around the issue of racial inequities and the history of racism in America. So we're gonna talk about NIMBYs, not in my backyard, the planning and zoning issues, the housing segregation issues, the school inequity issues. So there's a lot to cover here today. We won't get to all of it, but I will say that we need to make sure that we leave this audience with a desire and a hunger for more, because there is more. So let me just jump right in. And this question is an easy one for all of you. And it's, I like to get some opening thoughts about where you think we are, because a lot has happened in our country over the last year. And our country seems to be facing a reckoning with race. Do you think that we've really come to a tipping point, that people are just saying, it's now, we can't wait, like Mr. Baldwin just shared? Who wants to start? All right, so let me start with Bree. What are your thoughts? And then I'm going to Tim, Wes, and then Betsy.
Sure. I mean, in my view, I think there's a number of things going on. So I think that just in a very concrete way, we are facing structural breakdown, right? We have a federal government that is in gridlock. We are seeing our healthcare system being overwhelmed by a global pandemic. And there's an economic crisis. There are a lot of things that are reverberating from that. And the fact is that you can't address those structural issues without addressing racism. Racism is not a side issue to any of those things because racism has a lot to do with why the structural breakdown is happening, right? Racism has a lot to do with the election of Trump in the aftermath of the election of the first Black president. Racism has a lot to do with the resistance to funding universal health care. Racism has a lot to do with issues of houselessness in America and all these other things. So you can't, and of course, policing. So you can't really separate those things. I think, yes, we are at a point of reckoning somewhat, but I think it has to do with the fact of people realizing that we can't go any further without addressing those things. Voting, I mean, that's another thing that came up when we were looking at election integrity and the security of our elections. You can't separate issues of racism from issues of democracy and whether or not, the question of whether we even have a democratic structure in the United States of America. And so I think that we are at a crossroads point. We have been here before. I think that's the other important thing to recognize. And that's what you were lifting up. This is a long continual history. This is not the first time we have been here. So there's no guarantee that, we resolve these things. It will only happen if we are deliberate and intentional about trying to resolve these things.
Yeah, let me add to that because that's all exactly right. And I would just add to it this, the question as to whether or not this is a tipping point, that's for us to decide. I mean, that's going to be up to us. The default position of white America in particular, and I say this as a charter member, 52 years in the club, so I've been white a long time. The default position of white America is hitting the snooze button on this alarm clock of racial justice. Because think about how many tipping points we had. I mean, the Civil War, that's sort of a tipping point. You would think that all throughout our history where race has been the cleavage that has been at the heart of everything throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, we've had a lot of these moments that were supposed to wake us up. The civil rights movement, that was supposedly a wake-up call. I remember Katrina in 2005 was supposed to be a wake-up call. The shooting in Charleston, the massacre in Charleston, that was supposed to be a wake-up call. And folks hit the button. Eric Garner hit the button. Tamir Rice hit the button. Name after name after name. Now George Floyd, folks, sort of woke up for a minute. And I think the question is why and how do we sustain that? Now, I would suggest part of the reason that we're paying more attention right now, which is both good and bad, is that we're in this coronavirus moment where we're not going about our daily routine the same way, right? For most of us, not everybody, not frontline healthcare workers and other folks, but for most of us, our lives are way different right now than they were a year ago at this time. And as a result of that, we have a certain quietude, right? An ability to see things that maybe some of us were ignoring, hear some things that we were tuning out, and really feel some things, right? So George Floyd hits us in a way that Eric Garner did not, or a way that Tamir Rice or John Crawford did not, other killings on film, right? The question is, when we get on the other side of coronavirus, right, which hopefully we will, 250,000 dead right now, when we get on the other side, are we still gonna have that sustained energy? That's the open question. And what's so critical about what Bree said that I wanna echo here is, if you wanna solve any of these problems that we're talking about, why do we have 250,000 people dead right now? We have 250,000, we have singularly bungled this pandemic compared to any other country on the planet. We have singularly failed to respond to this because we have a broken public health system. We don't have a labor market that allows people to take time off and retain their jobs or have paid leave. We don't have safety nets to sustain people. So we require that business remain open because the business of America is business. Why are we that place? Well, if you trace the history, the reason we don't have those safety nets, the reason we don't have a functional public health system, the reason we don't have better labor markets for all workers is because of white supremacy and racism. The belief that if we have those things, those people will abuse the programs. If you don't believe me, there was a study that was done at Harvard a few years ago. I think it was Kennedy School that did it, where they found that when you look at all the different factors that explain white opposition to safety net programs, the number one most correlated factor with opposing the things that even millions of white people need is the belief that if you have better safety nets, Black people will cheat and they will abuse the program. So we end up not having things that we all need just to spite other people. And if you want to trace when the coronavirus turn happened, when all of a sudden we stopped taking it. Now, Trump never took it seriously, but there were a lot of folks that were early on. Even Tucker Carlson, of all people, was the one conservative who would go on air and say, hey, this is serious. We got to take this seriously. And then on April 7th, go back and look, April 7th of this year, the New York Times and the Washington Post front page headline that day says Black folks are disproportionately dying from this thing. That night, Tucker Carlson goes on the air and says, maybe this isn't such a big deal after all. And it's like 3 days later that Trump starts ranting about, we got to open everything back up. We got to get back to business. Now, do you think that's a coincidence? Because see, I think it's not. I think it's the fact that we said, some people said, oh, you mean it's those folks? Oh, we got to get back to work, y'all. What's the irony? The irony is about half of those 250,000 dead people are white. It's your white grandmother. It's your white immunocompromised spouse. It's your white child with diabetes. Those folks are dying too because we don't want to deal with this issue. So whether it's a tipping point or not is an open question, but it sure as hell better be, because if not, we're in for some awfully hard times ahead.
As usual, thank you for those provocative opening comments, and I'm sure it's going to stimulate a lot of questions from our audience. And so let me go to Wes to talk a little bit from his perspective.
And first, Clarence, thank you so much, and it's great seeing you. Thanks for your leadership, and to Bree and to Betsy and Tim. I'm a huge fan of all y'all. So to be on a panel with you is a big deal. So thank you. And you know, so I think the honest answer is about, do we know if this is a tipping point? I think as Bree and Tim says, you know, we just don't know yet, because many of the things that we have seen thus far have been performative. You know, they've been actions of people who said we're going to do X. They've been people blacking out their Instagram page. They've been things kind of showing measures of solidarity. But I'm not attacking a lack of solidarity. I need to attack structures, systems, because I think it's important for people to understand that, you know, it is, and as was highlighted earlier, you know, when we look at these twin crises that have brought themselves to our doorstep, you know, that brought us to the doorstep this past year, you know, one was the introduction of this virus that has had absolutely catastrophic health and economic implications in our society, and the other was this very unneeded reminder of how inequitable policing is in different communities. You know, the reality is, as Bree and Tim said, they actually, despite those two being two very different crises, they expose the exact same truth. And so when you're looking at everything, the fact that people of color, Black folks, Latinos, that they contracted COVID at twice the rate and also died at twice the rate. When you look at the fact that policing reform is necessary in all communities. But we did watch George Floyd's name being added to a much longer list of names that, to your point, Clarence, includes Michael Brown and Philando Castile and Freddie Gray and Arthur Anderson and Chris Brown and Tyrone West and Walter Scott and Sean Bell and Eric Gardner and Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor and John Crawford and Laquan McDonald and Tamir Rice and Ahmaud Arbery and Trayvon Martin. I mean, the names go on and on and on. But it really did expose this larger singular truth. And it is this idea that dealing with COVID is not about the discovery of a vaccine. Dealing with improper police practices is not about banning chokeholds. This is still getting at the underlying root of racism and the impact that race has on every single structure within our society. When you're looking at the fact that race is still the most predictable indicator of life outcomes that we have inside this country. And it's across the board. It's educational attainment, it's income and wealth, it's health, mental health, physical health, maternal mortality. you can't separate these individualized things. And so when I think about this idea and this concept of is it, are we on the brink of something bigger here? We have actually seen some groups, whether it is activist groups and organizations and corporations, in some cases, who have done some really actually hard and important things. And I think we can't lose sight of the importance of some of the things that certain places have done. But one distinct difference that I've seen and noticed about how people think about this is, are you doing something that is 2020 effective? Or are you doing something that you're actually changing the benchmarks of how you evaluate your entire organization and your framework from now on? Right? I was talking with one corporate leader. He's talking about how he's had an October board meeting and he brought a person in to talk to the board about bias and so on and so forth. And I said, that's great. And he said, I thought you'd be moving. I said, no, it's great. I said, it's like a book report. Right? You read a book and you come in and you give a book report on the book that you read. I said, but I think the really powerful thing is that, is that something that you're now going to, or is that a benchmark you're now going to add into every single time you meet with your board? Where you're going to evaluate your board, here's how we're doing on our numbers when it comes to recruitment and retention. Here's how we're doing when it comes to thinking about our board. Here's how we're doing when it comes to the allocation of our capital. And how we're thinking about everything from vendors and suppliers and who are accountants and who are attorneys. I said, that's a much more interesting thing to tell me than just simply, I brought someone in to talk to the board about bias. And so how are we thinking about our structures differently? And then I'll say in closing too, is, in thinking about, particularly as we're talking about from a legislative perspective, if we aren't truly understanding and dissecting the role that all of this plays in every single decision that we make, from the water we are asking children to drink, to the air we are asking them to breathe, to the schools they're asked to attend, to the homes they're being asked to live in, if we aren't putting a racial equity lens on every single aspect of our decision-making and putting real core evaluations and measurements, we're missing something. There's an ingredient you are missing in the legislations that you are pushing out. And so that type of thing those are the indicators that I know that I want to dig into when it comes to really understanding, is this a tipping point, or are people just trying to rush to get to 2021?
Well, Wes, thank you so much. And as you were saying those names, boy, I tell you, it really touched me emotionally because we know that there are so many that we don't know. And that was really, really important to do. So thank you. Mayor Hodges, Betsy, and you've been on the front line of many of these issues when you were former mayor of Minneapolis. Where are we? Are we at a tipping point in America?
And I'd also like to add my thanks for being here, and what an honor it is to be with this company. It's nice to be with all of you. I think a lot about white people and whiteness in the work that I do. And if past is prelude, then no, left to our own devices, white people probably aren't at a tipping point. Where we are is there's been an aperture opened. I think there's a window opened where a larger number than before of white people can see that maybe something's wrong with how we've set things up, that the systems are actually failing white people enormously, which we are trained not to see or think about, because we just think about, are we doing better than people of color? That's what whiteness trains white people to think. And really the comparison set is, how are white people doing compared to a world without racism? And in a world without racism, white people are actually doing very badly compared to that world. But we are trained to settle for this one because we're better off than people of color and indigenous people. And this is a moment where, with COVID, with our health systems and our federal government and our state governments failing everybody so badly, including white people, with the protests and the uprisings making it very much more clear that something's going on with policing, and maybe it isn't good for white people either. With 70+ million people having voted for Donald Trump, and what he represents, which a lot of white people didn't vote for him, although most of us did. There's this opening where white people have a sense, more of us, I think, have a sense there's something wrong and it should be different, and what can we do? And of course, our whiteness has trained us to not have any clue what to do, but more of a willingness. There's an opening, there's an aperture. And so I think the work before all of us, including and especially local government leaders, is to take advantage of this moment to push policy that isn't just about making white people feel less bad about race and our position in the racial hierarchy, but that would actually change what the systems are for, what the systems are designed to do. That instead of having, because most of our social systems and certainly our government systems were set up by white people for the care, convenience, comfort, thriving, and success of white people. That's what the systems are for. Until we change what they're for, they're going to keep getting the outcomes we've been getting for hundreds of years now. And so now is a time when we can have policy initiatives that are designed to actually change how the system functions and for whom, that we are included in the picture as white people of a world where, you know, it's not just about us. We're included in that future of, you know, that picture of the future, but we're not the only people in that picture of the future of who's thriving and for whom things are going well. This is the time, because there's a moment where a lot more white people are a little more open. There's going to be less resistance to those systemic policy changes than we usually have. One of the biggest barriers to real systems change, like Wes was talking about, is white resistance. The resistance that we put up and the power that we put behind that, which is, you know, helping keep the status quo running as it is, takes less energy on our part than actually changing the whole system. So there's a lot going in our direction, and there's less resistance right now to policy change, especially if we can paint a picture that everybody will be better off when we make those changes. So I don't know that we're at a tipping point. You know, as Tim said, as others have said, that's up to us. For white people, if our history is anything to go by, probably not. But we could make it one by actually changing what our systems are designed to do and for whom they are designed to do them.
So I'm gonna build on that a little bit, because, you know, we're talking to a diverse membership of municipal leaders across Connecticut. And all of those leaders bring their own lived experiences and their unconscious or conscious understanding of the role of race. As we look at the range of cities, towns in Connecticut, and as they have to advance racial equity and racial healing, and I always say they have to, because when you decided that you were going to run for office, maybe this was not the issue that you thought you would have to deal with. But once you raised your hand to say that you are going to serve that community, it is a must that you do this. And a lot of leaders are saying, oh, that's not an issue in my community. We all hear that so often. How do you start that conversation with people who feel that way, who really feel that this is not in my community, this is not impacting my community? Mayor, you want to start first, and then we can just let everybody jump in?
Sure. I would say, I'm going to assume that most of the people who say this are white people. I don't know a ton of people of color who think, or indigenous people who think that race and racism is not an issue in their community, or in the community next door that's mostly white. And the first thing I say, or I would say to somebody is, I hear you and I get it. I also was trained to think that it wasn't an issue, that if I wasn't feeling a certain kind of negative feeling and I wasn't behaving in a certain negative kind of way, that I wasn't being racist. And therefore, since racism, since the civil rights movement, white people have defined it as a personal failing and a personal feeling, that it's not an issue. And that in our community, if things are going well for me, then things must be going well for everybody. I was trained to think that. We train white people to think that way. The system relies on most of us thinking that. It relies on training us into our whiteness that way. So I do my best to identify in with that because I am white and I've been there. And then I approach the idea of it's absolutely 100% not true. And what I, you know, and I would explain that our systems were set up for white people to thrive and do well, and it's inherently at the expense of indigenous people and people of color, inherently. And that as a result, until we change how the systems are functioning, the systems will still get those results no matter how any of us who play a role in those systems feel. And this is the case that I made to the people of Minneapolis when I was mayor. I was very explicit about it, and I very explicitly talked to white people about our role. And the good news is not only do you have to do it, you get to do it. The entire community will be better off if we're not leaving all this genius on the table. If everybody is able and willing and given the opportunity to contribute to the prosperity and growth of the city. And right now our systems are designed to make sure only some people get to benefit from, certainly, and in most instances contribute to many of the great things about a city, although everybody contributes to how great things are, but some people benefit from it more than others, and some people are usually white people, I guess, is how I want to say that. And I would make that argument. You know, Policy Link has something called the Equity Atlas. You can go and see in your community how much wealth you're leaving on the table by letting the level of race-based systems exist in your city. In Minneapolis, when I was mayor, it was about 40 billion, pardon me, with a B, for the region by 2040 was just not circulating in our economy if we want to reduce it to economic issues, simply because we were prohibiting people of color and indigenous people from taking, you know, having the opportunities that white people had. It's expensive. It's very expensive.
That's great. Wes, what are your thoughts on that issue? About how do you start this conversation with folks that just say this really isn't true?
Yeah. No, and I think that first the mayor is absolutely right. We have to start from a place of helping people understand that that there is a complete interconnectedness between these issues of poverty, these issues of economic injustice, and race. And frankly, you don't have to look much further than just the data, right? Because, you know, I think about, I run one of the largest poverty fighting organizations in the country, and I can tell you it is foolish for people to make for anyone to make an argument that somehow race should be separate, or we don't focus on race, we focus on poverty, without understanding how completely interconnected those things not just historically have been, but continue to be. The fact that we have a 10-to-1 racial wealth gap in this country is not because one family worked 10 times harder, right? To be clear, the fact that, you know, we have historically funded literally tens of millions of dollars that's gone into educational frameworks with a core degree on making sure that we can get students not just to, but through higher education, because the data continues to show that a college degree increases lifetime earnings by nearly $1 million. Yet the research also shows that it's more complicated when you disaggregate the data. Because when you disaggregate the data, it also shows that Black college graduates on average earn less than white high school dropouts, right? That employers are just as likely to hire a white person recently released from prison as a Black applicant with no criminal history. That a Black child born to parents in the top quintile is just as likely to fall into the bottom income quartile in adulthood as they are to stay in the top income quintile. These things matter, and data matters. And this data should be the thing that's helping to lead the charge in terms of the policies that we are prioritizing and the ways that we're then spending budgets to be able to rectify the structural damage that has already been done and continues to show itself. And we do it in a frame, you know, not to play gotcha or I told you so or make people feel bad. Honestly, I think that we make a mistake when we argue that racism is just simply an act. You know, that, oh, a person says the N-word, that's racist. Got it. A person attends a white supremacist rally, that's racist. Clear. However, racism isn't just an act, it's a system. It's a system that allows these dynamics that we spoke about before to exist, and for us not to be able to move with a real deal of certitude and clarity as to how we're going to fix that. That's a system. And so as we're thinking about, the ways we have to, make the, make the case and make the argument, again, first it's just showing that we're not talking about a small portion of a population. I think, as the mayor said, some people can say, well, that's not really my population, so I don't have to necessarily deal with those issues. First of all, you cannot separate those two things. And the second component is if you are not dealing with this issue of economic disparity, if you're not dealing with the issue of poverty, then you are derelict in any type of role or seat that you are currently holding. And it doesn't not have a cost. I mean, the cost of child poverty in this country right now is anywhere between 800 billion and 1.1 trillion dollars. That is the cost of child poverty that we pay every single year for the fact that we are not even giving children an opportunity to control their own destiny. And so being able to give people a rallying idea and something that we can tangibly get done and fix, and to show them simultaneously that being able to look at it through a racial lens it's not submission. It's truth. It's not giving up. It's data. And allowing those things to help lead your conversation, to be able to pull people who might not, even if they aren't quite there yet, the data is the data, and allow that to be a foundation as to how you're thinking about the change that you actually want to create throughout your entire community.
Tim, how do you start this conversation with folks who feel like this is not in my community?
Well, going back to something that Betsy said, the people who say that tend to be white folks, not exclusively, but tend to be. And so what I always do, even before I get to the data, and I'm so glad that Wes brought out some of the data that he did, because it's really helpful. But even before I get to that, my first response is, well, how would you know? How would you know whether it was an issue? Because, like, if a woman were to say to me that sexism is an issue, or rape culture is an issue, misogyny is an issue, I'm not going to go check with a bunch of dudes to see if she's right. Right? If someone with a disability who faces ableism says to me, ableism is a problem, I'm not going to go ask a bunch of able-bodied people whether they think ableism is an issue in their community. I'm going to go check with the folks who were the target of whatever the mistreatment is. And yet, sort of what we do as white folks is we're like, well, I don't see the problem, and I'm going to ask these other white people who were in my family, who work near me, who live next door to me, and they're all going to be like, goodness, no. What? Why would you check with such experts as this? I don't mean to be cruel, but if you go back and you look at the data from the early 60s, I'm talking Gallup polls, right? The sort of gold standard of polling at that time, and still considered pretty good. The Gallup polls in 1963 asked white Americans, do you think that Black folks are treated equally in your community? Now, this is a really easy question, y'all. Like, this is not rocket science. It's not an AP class. This is not a 600 level. This is like intro remediation stuff. Do you think in 1963, before the Civil Rights Act has even been passed, before the Voting Rights Act has even been passed, 5 years before the Fair Housing Act has even been passed, the year of the March on Washington, 200,000 something Black folks and white allies and others showing up in DC because things are problematic and unequal. And the Gallup poll asked white folks, do you think everything's equal? And 2 out of 3 white folks that year said, yep. I think everything's fine. In 1962, Gallup asked white folks, do you think Black children have the same chance to get a good education as white children? Come on, y'all. It's 8 years after Brown v. Board. We know the answer is no. There's not a single school system in America that is moved to equalize anything, but white Americans get asked that question. And in 1962, 85 out of 100 white people said, yeah, I think everything's pretty good. So basically what I'm saying is I do not trust the judgment of the dominant group who doesn't have to know better to actually know better. So if you want to know whether the problem is a problem, check with the folks who live the problem. That's the first piece of advice, because we would do that in any other category. We would, any other problem, social problem that you can think of, crisis, you would ask the people who were affected by it. Right? Who were the targets of it. And so, I've had this experience where I go to places. I remember the first time I went to Oregon, for a speech. This is 25 some odd years ago. And people in this Oregon town, this wasn't even Portland, which at least has a longstanding Black community, but it was like a more rural part of Portland, Oregon. And they said, oh, we don't have a racism problem here. And I said, well, how do you know? And they said, well, we don't have any Black people here. I'm like, well, maybe that's y'all's problem, right? And maybe you need to ask what the history is that means you don't have Black people, because it turns out that's not a coincidence. There was an edict that was established in the Oregon territory that said Black folk got to get out, and if we catch you here, we will deal with you in a less than salutary way, right? And so when you live in a community where there aren't a lot of Black and brown folks, that didn't just happen. White folks act like that's a coincidence, like redlining wasn't a thing, like housing discrimination wasn't a thing, like FHA loans, government-backed loans now for white people. From 1934 to 1962, $120 billion worth of housing equity loaned preferentially to white people. Like, that didn't happen. There's a reason your suburbs look the way that they look, or your exurbs, or your small towns, or your rural communities. It's not that Black folks didn't want to live in that area where the trash got picked up twice a week and the schools had more resources. It's not like Black folks said, no, I'll just stay here where the lead is in the paint and in the soil from the exhaust and we don't have any jobs. Right? That was deliberate. So when folks say, well, we don't have an issue because these people are not present, that is the issue. We have to reframe the way that we think about that.
Thank you, Tim. Bree?
Yeah, so I am, I'm a grassroots community organizer here in North Carolina. And one of the things that is really interesting, I find, is community is a very loaded word. That term is very loaded. If you go into any group of people and you ask them to identify, like, what are the top issues in your community? One of the first questions is going to be, how are we defining community? What community? There was one instance I remember where I was like going door to door, like just kind of doing a survey, an issue survey. And I used the word community and people were like, what community are you talking about, right? I think in any given city, in any given area, there are a lot of communities within community. I do think, though, that also, and I don't know how much, America is the only place that I have lived, so I can't do like a comparison to a lot of other places, but there's a real strong strain of individualism in America. We have this concept of rugged individualism, this idea that you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, that, we do a lot of mythologizing around the self-made person, the person who was, born into poverty and just managed to kind of pull themselves up by themselves. And that kind of serves as this mythical model for how everyone is supposed to achieve the American dream, right? And quite frankly, like, that strain of thinking is what's killing us right now. In a very real way. And I don't think that there is a more concrete example of how interconnected humanity and life and the world really is than what we're seeing right now with the pandemic, right? We're talking about a virus that began in a bat on the other side of the world and has now traveled through millions of people, has killed 250,000 people in our society. We have to walk around, wearing masks and taking these other precautions because we are coming into contact with each other. It's a very real, concrete demonstration of how the health of one individual in this society impacts the health of all of us, right? The conversation that we're having right now over debt, I find very interesting. You see a lot of people saying, well, if you cancel student loan debt for the people who still have it, what about all the people who already paid it off? And there's like this lack of recognition that if a significant segment of the country defaults on debt and falls into poverty, it takes the entire economy down, right? And so I think that we have to, and that kind of thinking is not only limited to white America. I think it's a very kind of American way of thinking that often comes up time and time again. And so there really has to be a value shift overall. There has to be this recognition that, the well-being of the most marginalized among us, the well-being of the poorest among us impacts the quality of life overall. And that is true. That's the actual truth. Like, this idea that somehow I just exist in my own bubble, and because I have, stable housing, and because I have a car, and because I happen to have, a job right now, right? There's a lot of people who have fallen into poverty this year who at the beginning of this year were not in that state, so just because I'm in a good position right now, this idea that I'm fine and whatever is happening to anyone outside of my bubble doesn't really affect me is completely illusory and untrue. That is a concrete physical reality of the world that we live in. And so I think that, that's something that Martin Luther King spoke to as well. Like, he was not simply talking about let's integrate the people who have been marginalized from the current system into the current system. He was saying the current system has to change, right? It's not just that we allow non-white people to participate in the existing system. It's that the existing system is literally killing us. And I mean, I think that's part of what Tim was speaking to, this idea that, at the beginning of this pandemic, when it kind of became clear, it's, the people who are most vulnerable are going to be the elderly, it's going to be non-white people, it's going to be people who have to, work the service job. So if I can stay in my house and I don't have any pre-existing conditions, then, why should I care about what happens? And eventually that's going to come knock at our door. I mean, it is right now. People are realizing, I can't gather with folks in the way that I wanted to, or people don't realize how vulnerable they are until they actually get sick. And so I do think that this conversation around community and collectivism and what's happening somewhere and how is it, impacting me here, is fundamentally a conversation about values, is fundamentally a conversation about humanity and how are we valuing each other. There are places in this country I have never been to, but I know that what's happening there is absolutely impacting what's happening here. I've not been to South Dakota, right? And I believe South Dakota's hospital system is overwhelmed right now. It would be naive of me to think that what is happening in South Dakota and its hospital system being overwhelmed is not going to have an impact eventually, even if I'm not feeling it right now, on the healthcare system here in North Carolina. And that takes leadership, right? We have a lot of people in positions of leadership who are not leading in that way, who are not calling for collectivism, who are not, pushing us to consider the needs or the concerns of those who are most marginalized in our society. It's not just an act of charity. It's not just about what you're doing out of the kindness of your heart. It is about recognizing that quite literally, if we allow children to go without proper education, as many are falling through the cracks right now because we haven't provided them with the necessary digital infrastructure during this pandemic, right? If we allow people to fall into poverty, that's going to come back to bite all of us. So we have to recognize the collective interest that we have.
No, I think that that's a great point. And we often say in city government, what happens in Minneapolis impacts Chicago. What happens in Chicago impacts Bridgeport, Hartford, Connecticut, because any social justice movement that happened in Portland tends to also happen in Washington, D.C. And I love that concept of collectivism and working all to us not always thinking as an individual, but as a community and defining community. Wes, I want to pick up on something that Bree just talked about, and that was the pandemic and the fact that it's having an impact on every community across the country. Let's talk about data again. The data shows that the pandemic disproportionately impacts Blacks, Latinx, and Indigenous communities at a higher rate. Why are we seeing these disparities? And if you were in a spot as you are, to give local leaders some advice on how to address the disparities, I want to start with you, and then go to Tim, Betsy, and then back to Bree.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think some of the heartbreaking realities as to why we're seeing the discrepancies is that it's also goes back to who are we asking to battle this virus in different ways, right? When you're considering the fact that 70% of all essential workers are people of color, who don't have the same kind of luxuries, to be able to do Zoom calls or take their meetings in front of computers. These are the people who we were sending back out without proper PPE, without proper federal or governmental support, or even their private sector employment support. And so, and not only did we see that, we saw the reality of a virus that one of the things that's just so damaging about COVID, as we have learned, is that it attacks vulnerabilities in really horrific ways. That for people, if a person is in, relatively good health and good shape, that statistically that person, will be able to, will be sick, but then will have a better chance than not of being able to survive it. Unless you have a pre-existing condition, or in many cases, a battery of pre-existing conditions. And when you look at the long legacy of health disparities that we have in this country along racial lines, it is very easy to see why COVID-19 has had such a disastrous impact, particularly when you're talking about a virus that attacks vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities that we've allowed to sit, vulnerabilities that we've allowed to, that we've condoned, and we haven't moved on. And in many ways, by a lot of the decisions that we collectively have made, have exacerbated. And so we see how this thing has shown itself in so many really harmful ways. And to be very honest, the way and the guidance that I would give folks as to how do we combat that is by doing the things that we should have been focusing on beforehand. Because one of the things we've seen when it comes to COVID-19 is that, again, it's not just an exacerbation, it's an exposure of things that we knew were there. And we knew how these discrepancies and the disparities showed themselves. And it goes back to everything from how are we talking about access to capital and who we're involving in the conversation. And this goes back to, a point that Tim was making earlier. But, I look at the fact that right now, currently, people always talk about how there's no private capital that goes to, entrepreneurs of color. They're not going to Black entrepreneurs, et cetera. And how it's less than 2% of private equity money that goes towards them. And we say that as if what's happening on both the governmental and the philanthropic side is hardly any different. We say that as if that it's just them. No, if you look at philanthropy, there has been a 400% increase in philanthropic dollars that have gone towards philanthropy over the past 2 decades. Over that same time period, around 10% of it has gone to organizations that are led by people of color. Right? So we're looking at a massive increase in dollars that have gone towards philanthropy. And how not just on an absolute, but on a relative basis, the numbers have absolutely have dropped in terms of the percentage basis of it going to organizations that are led by people of color. And so not only does it show how measures and elements of systemic racism are even showing themselves, even in places like philanthropy, but it doesn't make sense. Because if you're trying to solve the challenge, if you're really trying to solve the problem, there is no way you're going to be able to get that done without not just the voices, but also the input and the leadership of impacted communities at the forefront of that conversation. And, we end up, and it's important for people to understand that if you are doing that, if that is how you are leading, and if that, when you look at your numbers honestly, and that's what you're seeing, your altruism will be viewed as something else. And so once again, it goes back to this idea of how are we confronting these things that we knew were issues before COVID-19, that we just never had the fundamental courage to be able to address. The fact that, to Tim's point, that we still have millions of children in this country who are suffering from lead poisoning, something that we have known as a neurotoxin for a century. Something that the CDC indicates that if anyone has any exposure of lead at all, it can be damaging. But if a person has over 5 micrograms of lead in every deciliter of blood, that person will have cognitive damage for the remainder of their life. I think about the case in the story of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, a 25-year-old young man who makes eye contact with police. And literally, I bring that up because that was his crime. Because in certain neighborhoods, making eye contact and running can trigger probable cause. Not in every neighborhood. In other neighborhoods, if that would have happened, he'd have been going for a jog. But he did in Harlem Park. He did it in Sandtown, Winchester. So it triggers probable cause. He's arrested. And then an hour after he's arrested, he's in a coma. Later on, it finds out that he had 3 broken vertebrae and a crushed voice box. And he stays in a coma for a week until he's eventually not able to make it out of the coma. And the reality of his death and the reality of his killing in police custody in Baltimore, that's what led to the 2015 unrest that took place in Baltimore. But the reality is, if you look at the conditions of the life that he lived prior to that, we need to be mourning that just as hard. Because this was a young man who was born premature and underweight. This was a young man who was born to a mother who lived in deep poverty her entire life. She never made it to high school. She could not read nor write. This was a young man whose mother battled addiction for much of her life. This was a young man who was exposed to heroin before he was even born. When they moved into a housing project after he gained enough weight to be able to leave the hospital, the housing project, along with 480 other homes, were cited in a civil lawsuit because of the endemic levels of lead inside of that home. Or we talked about before about how 5 micrograms is enough to trigger significant cognitive damage for the remainder of their life. Freddie Gray had 36. So this was a young man who was born premature, underweight, exposed to heroin, born in deep poverty, lead poisoned. By that time in his life, he's 2 years old. And so when people ask the question, what can we do in this post-COVID environment? Do the things you didn't do in the pre-COVID environment. Focus on all the elements that we see that it continues to show us every single day about how these disparities show themselves. There's nothing that we are seeing here now that in any way is like, aha, I got it. Because the only thing that COVID has continued to do has just continued to push on the fissures that we just refuse to acknowledge and that we refuse to move on. As long as that's going to be the case, there is nothing new about COVID that's going to tell us anything that we haven't or that we do not already know about the measures and the impacts of inequity that still very much live within our society and how amazingly color and class coded that inequity is. And so focus on those things that we knew before 8 months ago can be the core thing we can do to focus on the things that we now have to deal with.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And I just want to add, to it this. I think we need local leaders who obviously can't do this in a vacuum. A lot of this is a result of a lack of federal leadership and the fact that we have devolved so many responsibilities from schooling to public health to public safety down to the local level, which means we get this crazy patchwork of effective or ineffective all throughout the country. And I personally don't think we're going to solve systemic racism by devolving all of these issues down to the local level. We're going to have a much more coordinated effort. That said, this is the kind of system we currently live in, which means that local leaders, as they attempt to leverage statewide resources and as they attempt to leverage federal resources and as they attempt to leverage the private equity resources that exist in their communities, and God knows the state of Connecticut has a lot of those. It's a lot of money in Connecticut. It's not evenly distributed, but there's a lot of money there that can be leveraged. As all of that's happening, local leaders are going to have to demonstrate courage. And when I say that, I don't mean that in some banal, like hyperbolic way. I mean the kind of courage that could cost you your job. I mean, Betsy's on this call. She knows, as the mayor of Minneapolis, that her stance on these issues came at a political cost to her. And yet she took those stances anyway. And that's okay. That's what you're supposed to do. She took heat from white folks that didn't want to deal with this issue at all. She took heat from Black and brown folks that didn't think she dealt with it enough. And yet she stayed in the ring and refused to walk away. She didn't walk away when she got flack from racial justice activists for not doing enough. She didn't say, oh, well, I'll take my toys and go home then, and I don't want to be in this struggle anymore because y'all criticize me and I was trying to be the good white liberal. And she didn't quit when other white folks, tried to say that because she posed for a picture with a community activist and they waved at the camera that she was throwing up gang signs. You have to be courageous enough to take flack from everybody if you're going to get in the arena and do this work. And sadly, we have a political culture that doesn't reward courage at all. We have a political culture that rewards doing the easy and expedient thing. And so we've got people right now who are willing to sort of wink and nod at the highest level of power in this country, no matter what that individual does, because they're afraid of being voted out of office by the people that are beholden to him. Well, local leaders are going to have to be courageous enough to say, you know what, here's the thing. I will die on this hill of racial justice and racial equity, this thing that we haven't dealt with for over 200 years, really 400 going back to the colonies. I'll lose my job over this one. And if you're not prepared to face down folks and lose your job over this cause, then I don't know what are we talking about? What are we doing? I mean, if your job security is more important than doing right by your community and by this country, then you need to find a different hobby and one that the taxpayers don't pay for. Bree?
Yeah, so I mean, in addition to agreeing with everything that has been said, I also think we really need to shift our linguistic framing of this issue so we really understand what's happening, right? Like race is a socio-political construct. This is something that has been engineered through government policy, through court cases over the recent centuries. This is not a biological reality. So when we describe people as being vulnerable, right, it's important to understand that no one is inherently vulnerable because of their race, right? When Wes was pointing out how like the greatest determining factor in life outcomes in this country is race, that's not because of someone's biology. That is because we are living under a system of violence that engineers those outcomes. And that's important to name and to acknowledge. A lot of this conversation around how COVID is impacting, disproportionately impacting communities of color, Black people and Indigenous communities and people of color, folks describe it as vulnerabilities, as having, more likely to have pre-existing conditions or to occupy or to have occupations that, are more likely to expose you to COVID. All of that is a direct result of policy. It's a direct result of social practice. This is not something that just inherently exists. And that's important to understand in the conversation, so we can recognize that the only way to really address that is, again, through policy, through addressing the very things that engineered those conditions in the first place. And I agree, that takes political courage. It always has. There's never been a time where when you are trying to address an unjust status quo or people being very set in their ways, that it doesn't require political risk and courage. That requires another level of leadership. It requires something that is beyond performative governance. Like I would describe a lot of what we are getting now, oftentimes in government, is performative, right? And it's important to recognize too that a lot of the change that we see, when we do see it happen, it bubbles up from the bottom. It's people protesting in the street. It's people, voting, but also really holding elected officials to account, engaging in direct action, organizing communities. That is what it has always taken. And it will require leaders who are committed to something greater than just holding on to their elected office. There are all these political leaders that we love to kind of valorize, throughout history, whether it's Lincoln or Kennedy or LBJ, some of these other figures. But what people often gloss over is how they often had to go against whatever was most popular at the time. You can't just wait for there to be popular support for racial justice in order to take the actions that are going to be necessary to bring racial justice about. That has never been the case. And so, what I see happening right now in a lot of the conversation is it's already too timid in my view, right? We're looking at, I do a lot of work around housing, for instance. We're looking at millions of people being evicted from their homes. In the next month or so. I mean, people are continuing to be evicted right now, but we're really looking at like this massive wave of evictions across the country. That's not only an economic crisis, that's a public health crisis. You're talking about putting people out of their homes in the middle of winter as we are seeing this spike in COVID cases right now. And people are debating how much relief is too much. I mean, that should not be the conversation at all. The conversation should be, what do we need to do to save lives? And I think if you look at any of the major crises that we have ever faced in the past, whether it was, the rise of fascism in Europe, whether it was the Great Depression, at the beginning of the 20th century, whether it was, the Civil War, the only reason that we had the outcomes that we had was because of people being willing to exercise a certain amount of courageous leadership. I hope that, we have leaders who will step to the forefront, but I also think that it is very important for everyday people to recognize that a lot of the change depends and always has depended on our ability to organize ourselves and to make those things happen. And I mean, obviously that's my perspective as a grassroots community organizer, but I really emphasize that to people, like, as much as we are talking about what elected officials need to do, a lot of it also depends on our ability to organize ourselves and to continue to demand what it is that we really need for ourselves and for our communities. Because even when we have someone in an elected office who promises to, fulfill what we need and is representing us, if we're not organized to support that person, they will be crushed. Like they really are going up against a very highly organized system. And so I think that is very important for us to recognize in this moment. It is structural. It's not biological. These are structures and these are policies that have to be changed.
So let me thank you, Bree, and I think that as we continue this conversation, I want to move to some of the research that I've learned.
Can I pop in, because I didn't get a chance to address this, and I want to speak to.
I'm sorry. I don't know if you guys noticed, but the lights went out in DC, so I disappeared for a minute. So I'm
glad you're back, but I really do want to piggyback on what my fellow panelists were saying.
Thank you.
Because the idea that the disparities we're seeing in the COVID outcomes are what the systems are set up to provide. They're operating exactly as they were set up to operate to get exactly these results. It's perfectly set up to get these exact results. And the conversations that we've been having are about, okay, so as a local municipal official, what do I do about that? And I support and appreciate everything my fellow panelists have said. And as a former elected municipal official, I was a city council member for 8 years. I was mayor for 4 years, explicitly working on these issues. Every elected official is some combination of three things. We want to do good work. We want to do the right thing. And if we can, we want to keep our jobs and or leave a legacy. And what combination you are of those three things, whether you're one of them, two of them, or three of them, is going to have an impact on how you go about doing this work. And I would say no matter what your motivations are, doing this work, addressing the disparities, as Wes as everybody, but as Wes was addressing in particular, this is the work that should have been happening before COVID hit, and COVID is just illuminating the fact that work didn't happen. So what do you do now? And if you're a white elected official in particular, often white people, we feel like we don't know what to do. There's part of the whiteness that we get socialized into is feeling completely ignorant about race and completely hopeless and discouraged about being able to do anything about it. That serves the system as it operates, which is why we're socialized that way. You know more than you think. You know what policies would make a difference. If you don't, you have some ideas about where you could get those ideas. They're national organizations, policy. You could ask Bree, ask Wes. They know what policy changes at the municipal level would make a difference in your community. There are people in your community who know, and you can ask them. You can have conversations with them and ask. Even the people you're a little scared to ask, find ways to build those relationships and start asking that question. Find somebody who knows them if you don't know them yourself yet. Build those relationships. Then make a decision about what policy change would actually change how your systems function and operate. What would make it so that the entrepreneurs in your community could succeed? The entrepreneurs of color and indigenous entrepreneurs, what is getting in the way? Right now, your systems are set up for white entrepreneurs to do well and for entrepreneurs of color not to do as well. What is it in your system that's getting in the way? Take any issue and ask that question and go and ask the entrepreneurs of color themselves. Then figure out what policy might change that outcome. and then figure out a strategy to pursue that policy, but spend some time on the front end building the relationships you need in the community to back you as you take that policy forward. Don't leap alone. And make sure that you strategize on the front end about the resistance you're going to face from white people once they figure out that this is a policy that doesn't benefit only us, because that happens every single time. And we know it happens, and we very rarely strategize around it. For leaders of color, it's consequential to name that we need a strategy around white resistance. And for white people, we just don't think about the fact that we need a strategy around white resistance, but we do. So come up with that strategy. What do we say? What do we need to say on the front end? How do we make the case that this is good for everybody in the community, including white people? You may have to explicitly talk to white people, which I know is taboo. Get some comfort talking to white people about whiteness. It helps if you're a white leader in a community to doing racial equity work. That is how you can move forward. And I'm saying that right now is a moment to do that work, because there are a lot of white people in your community who are going to be less resistant to change because they see what's going on in a way that they haven't. And the clamps, the blinders have gone like this, and they are slowly going to move back this way over the next year, the next 18 months. But for now, they're like this, or even like this. It gives you more opportunity to do the policy work that maybe until this moment you didn't know how to do, or you didn't quite know, it's fruitless, it won't pass. Organize around it. Take an organizing mindset to the work you're doing at City Hall. It really can work.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks, Betsy. I appreciate that perspective. And I agree that it is going to take a now attitude to address these issues, because it is an opportunity. I want to shift specifically to Connecticut for a moment. In doing some research, there was a recent report by edbill.org, a predominantly non-white, dealing with predominantly non-white school districts in Connecticut, which receive an average of 17% less funding than predominantly white schools. Efforts to address education segregation and corresponding inequities in funding had led to a formation of a community resistance group called Hands Off Our Schools. I want to dig into that a little bit, because some talked about it being a local control issue, that they wanted to maintain the control over their school district. And therefore, just because they got a higher percentage in wealthier communities. But some are saying that this is a way of fighting against poor Black and brown people to keep them out of their system. I mean, any reaction to that, and how do local leaders in Connecticut manage this issue? Tim, I'm going to start with you on that one.
Sure. So first, whenever I hear a community organization that's titled Hands Off My Whatever It Is, my first instinct is to ask whose hands are supposed to stay off, because somebody's hands are on the system, somebody's hands are on those schools, somebody's hands are doing that to people who are not in that community. And so I always sort of start with the assumption that there's a normativity, if you will, a framing that is itself part of the problem. The idea that we can put our hands all over this stuff and do whatever we want because it's ours, and the rest of y'all need to leave us alone, which is really no different. I mean, I'm from the South, if y'all hadn't figured that out. And I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and there are a lot of lunch counter owners that said hands off our businesses. There were school folks when I grew up and I was a child of integration here in Nashville Metro Public Schools, one of the first graduating classes to be fully integrated when I graduated in 1986. This is not ancient history. There were plenty of white families that in the early 70s, when that process was beginning, they created similar organizations. They weren't all mouth-breathing segregationists like the ones at Little Rock Central High in 1957 that you can see in old footage, but they were all people who had this assumption of entitlement. We are entitled to better than you. We are entitled to more than you because we have quote unquote earned it. Keeping in mind what I said before, the suburbs that were usually wealthier and now exurbs that are often better off didn't just come about because of hard work or what Bree was talking about, rugged individualism. They came about because government created the white middle class, created it. There was no white middle class before the FHA, before the VA loans, before the GI Bill, before the New Deal. There was just the haves and the have-nots. The government created the white middle class. And white middle class folks don't want to admit that. And they want to say, oh, I did it all on my own. That's nonsense. You were not raised on an island by a porpoise. You had help, and some of that help was from the government to which you pay taxes. So when folks say, I'm entitled to more than you, even though we're both responding to public programs, this is public education, that's nonsense. You're not entitled to more, but folks think they are. So number one, whose hands? I like I said, I grew up in Nashville, and I will tell you this, I'm fortunate to have grown up in a family that had a very different view. My mother in particular made the decision when I was a child. She sent me quite deliberately to an early childhood ed program, preschool program at Tennessee State University, historically Black college on the other side of Nashville from where I grew up. She did that for a couple of reasons. Number one, she wanted me to have an integrated early childhood experience because she thought that would be beneficial to me, in a new social context of integrated schools. Secondly, she did it to piss off her parents. We don't have time to process that piece. The third reason she did it was because she knew that those teachers were some of the best teachers in any preschool program in the city. She understood that not only was the stereotype not correct, it was the opposite, that I would be better off going to that institution. And when it came time to go to K-12, she was upset when they shut down the mostly Black middle school / junior high that I would have been sent to, because a lot of white parents complained they didn't want their white children going over there with those lower income working class kids. My mother wanted me to go there. You know why? Not for some liberal social experiment, not because she just wanted to have some kumbaya moment for her child, but because she understood those teachers and those parents were some of the best teachers and the most invested parents in the outcomes of education, because they had to be, because their lives depended on it. She knew that it would be better for me. So when these white folks try to stop the equalization of resources or the sharing of resources and hoard these resources to ourselves, it's not just that we do an injustice to others, we're not helping ourselves. I benefited, I grew as a human being because of my connectivity to those Black folks that I went to school with, beginning at the age of 4 at Tennessee State, and ultimately then within integrated schooling in K-12. It was precisely my mother's decision that I wasn't entitled to better, that I wasn't entitled to more, right? That I was that we were all in need of one another's educational success that created, the person who I became. So this is not helping anyone. This isn't just oppressive or marginalizing. This is not conducive to excellence, even on the part of those white folks who think they're doing right by their kids by keeping these other folks out of their community. You're not doing right by anyone's children when you do that.
Let me open it up. Who wants to jump in on that? Wes, thoughts?
So I can go first. I mean, and I think it's a when you were talking, Clarence, about why this whole thing even got triggered, you're saying that Ed Build was saying that that there was a 17% funding discrepancy between non-Black districts and predominantly Black districts. So, we see that this is not only, it's not only a trend and something that goes on, in Connecticut and well past, but it's also something that does have bigger implications on whose lives and which communities do we actually value. Because because when we look at what our schools are and what our schools really do represent, we talked about it earlier, and I think that this pandemic has actually helped to really illuminate it as well, is when people are talking about what are schools and how should we be thinking about the funding it's not only a trend and something that goes on, in Connecticut and well past, but it's also something that does have bigger implications on whose lives and which communities do we actually value. Because because when we look at what our schools are and what our schools really do represent, and we talked about it earlier, and I think that this pandemic has actually helped to really illuminate it as well, is when people are talking about what are schools and how should we be thinking about the funding of them and the support of them, it's not just the place where our students and our kids are getting their educational credentialing. It also happens to be the largest food provider for our children. It also happens to be the largest mental health provider for our kids. It's also the largest childcare provider in the country. That the weight of what happens within our schools is massive, and it has a whole lot more than just simply to do with the credentialing. And so when we have, these debates about, where should funding go and how should we think about allocation and so on and so forth, this has much bigger implications and actually is much more underlined than just simply how people are talking about the distribution of wealth in school districts. This is something much bigger. And it really does underline the core fulcrum of the role that education and schools play in terms of enhancing true levels of economic mobility in our society to be able to attack the thing that each one of my co-panelists have talked about throughout this entire conversation. And so when we're, these aspects about even the localized funding in schools in Connecticut, and when people say, well, what do schools need in order to be successful in this moment? The answer is actually very easy. It's what are the things that the affluent districts are getting? It's really not that element of rocket science. The fact that we still have kids who will go into school and the 13th thing on their mind is that biology test they have in third period, because they're still worried about things like food and housing and transportation and what's going to happen to their family members. The fact that we can still have these elements of discrepancies that exist even in the post-COVID environment when it comes to our schooling, where we are going to have children who will go an entire school year and not walk into a school building. We know that they're estimating that around 17% of our children will not complete this school year. We know that right now in Baltimore City, for example, only 50% of kids are logging on consistently to remote learning. This is about much more than just schools. This is really about how are we thinking about the allocation of all of our resources and which bodies and which families and which communities do we honor and support and see. And so I think, Tim's point is exactly right on, not only does the titling in that matter when you talk about hands up our schools, but it really has to also go down to that bigger fundamental question about who are we actually fighting for in these roles? And what are the things we're actually thinking about when it comes to providing the right kind of, not just resources in terms of schooling and school funding, but the actual scaffolding that the school infrastructure and the school experience is to both highlight and also propel for our kids inside of that structure. That's really the underlying question that I think all of that really has to pose and push.
So Betsy, as I come to you, one of the expanded parts of this question is from one of our attendees. Talk about that Connecticut is not a county-based school system, that schools are supported by each town's tax-paying residents. And how do we address that reality of that inequity or that inequitable funding in a system like that? What's your thought generally, and then with your background of being in municipal, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, in general, I would look at it a couple of ways. First, anybody, I would imagine, I can't speak for the people in, the folks of color and the indigenous folks in the schools, but I imagine what they're hearing from the white folks who are saying hands off our schools. And it's interesting to talk about a government service as ours. I imagine they are people who think other government services are theirs and therefore don't need funding. But the experience of that, I imagine, is you want our kids to do badly and you want them to keep doing badly. And I imagine the white folks who are participating in this movement are thinking, hey, look, I want your kids to do fine, but what I really want is for my kids to do well, and you are trying to change how well my children are going to do. You're trying to redistribute negative outcomes here, and we're getting positive outcomes, and we want to keep getting positive outcomes, so you keep your negative outcomes and stop trying to redistribute them to us. That is usually, I think, what white parents are saying, whether they know it or not. And a couple things that I would say to that are, first, if you find a model for schools, and I'm not sure anybody's cracked this code, but when we find a model for school funding that is implemented where all kids are doing well, where kids who need X, Y, and Z to do well get X, Y, and Z, and kids who need A, B, C to do well get A, B, and C, the entire community benefits from that, including white people. Like, white people's outcomes are better when kids of color get good educations, period. And so for white liberals who think, oh, this isn't affecting me, I just want to keep these positive outcomes, you're actually your activism is in the name of creating fewer positive outcomes. It's not redistribution of negative outcomes. You're just trying to prevent more positive outcomes from being created. Now, the other thing I would say to those white parents is your belief that protecting your white child is different than actively wanting bad outcomes for kids of color. That's a false notion. The success that white people get in this country is built on a foundation of people of color and indigenous people doing less well than we are doing. They are inextricably linked in this country. Race was based on that idea. All of our systems were based on that idea. We can't have white people doing better and not have people of color not doing as well. And so your drive to have your white children doing better than other children, inherently, those two things are linked. You can't say, I'm just trying to protect my kids, I'm not trying to hurt those kids. They're one and the same thing. And so the invitation to open up our hearts and to open up our minds to think what would be good for everybody would be what is good for everybody. And that includes me. I think as white people, we don't do a great job of painting a picture for one another that a racially equitable future, or better, a non-raced future is good for us, that we're in that picture, that we are doing well in that picture. And I'm here to say we are in the picture. And we are doing well in that picture. It is possible to have a future where we don't do better than other people, but we're still doing as well or better than we are now. That is possible. We can create that as a community. We have to put our shoulders to that wheel if it's going to happen. And so as the municipal governance side of that question, I imagine there are a number of people hiding behind a local control argument. This isn't about race. This is about local control. And I was a mayor. I know how important local control is. I know what it's like to have your state government swoop in and tell you what you can and can't do. And when it's something that your city has been able to make a decision about for generations, and all of a sudden the state government doesn't like what you're doing and they swoop in. Fine. And I understand arguments about local control. And there's no policy. The question for you is whether, are you really trying to defend local control, or are you really trying to keep people of color's hands off your white schools, first of all? And second of all, the biggest question you should be asking yourself is, how do we get the best possible outcome? And usually people trying to swoop in and take away local control is in defiance of the best possible outcome. But here, I imagine that the local control argument itself is in defiance of the best possible outcome for the most possible students. And so re-examining it from that light, how do we get a good outcome? How do we get better life outcomes for our kids of color and our indigenous kids? That's the question to ask. That is the primary question to ask. How do we do it while ensuring that it's a communications question, that we reassure white parents that their children will also be doing well under whatever scenario is proposed? That's an important communication piece that isn't always considered, but it's important. But the policy question is, how do we reduce these disparities, not by bringing white outcomes lower, but by elevating outcomes for everybody?
Bree, any additional comments on that question? I know it's been
Well, I mean, I think that the central conflict is that the white middle class, like Tim pointed to, is built upon the stolen wealth and land of Black and Indigenous people. I mean, that's historical fact. That's an economic reality. So the whole conversation really centers on whether or not we are going to maintain race class hierarchy by either refusing to address that injustice on any level, or as the situation is all often framed, what minor percentage of the land and wealth that has been stolen is going to be allocated back to the descendants of the people it was stolen from and continues to be stolen from, right? Like this is not something that happened in one generation. This is something that is ongoing. This continues to go on through the stealing of wealth, gentrification, displacement, low wages. I mean, this is a cycle, a generational cycle that continues and continues and continues. So this is not something that happened in a one-off generation, and it's not continuing today. It is a system, again, that is maintained through policies. Poverty is maintained through policies. You can't separate the issue of housing segregation from the issues of schooling. One of the main reasons that we run into these issues when we're trying to address inequality in schools is because people are segregated in terms of where they live. So, we have these conversations over, well, how are you districting the schools? What is the tax base for the school? Where is it coming from? You've got the poor people are concentrated in one area, so of course they're not going to have the same kind of resources to fund the schools. They don't have the resources to fund the schools because the people who live and work there are denied the kind of, not only has wealth been stolen from them over multiple generations, they are denied access to the kind of employment that would provide them the kind of wealth that would provide them the kind of tax base to fund their schools. So that's the central conflict. I mean, again, I think that we get very much in this pattern of talking around race, right? Even among people who would like to characterize themselves as, good people, right? Or good white people. It's this conversation of, well, how do we perform charitable acts, for the marginalized, for the Black, for the Indigenous? But that money, I mean, when you're talking about reallocating some of the tax dollars towards folks, that's not charity. It's not a handout. We frame it that way, but it's not. There was not only like the stripping of wealth and land from these communities, but white people got handouts. They got, the middle class was engineered in a way that it is never engineered for other people. The laws serve to protect the class status of middle class white people in a way that it doesn't exist for other people. So again, there's going to be resistance to it, because what you're talking about, you can't achieve equity in schooling or in any other sector of this country without dismantling those structures, without dismantling the race class hierarchy. It can't be a situation where it's like, okay, a handful of Black students, a handful of Indigenous students will be able to attend what is still a fundamentally white and racist institution. The white racist institution can no longer exist. The school that is homogeneously, white and wealthy can no longer exist. And that's from, grade school at public school all the way up to the universities. This is the same conversation that's taking place on university campuses, right? Where we have to really talk about like what was the ideology that informed the creation of the structure to begin with. The segregated public school was created to engineer those exact outcomes. I mean, that was the whole purpose. I mean, we've got to remember, like Tim was pointing to, I mean, we're just 30, 40, 50 years removed from segregation. This is still very recent. And so the idea that somehow we're going to achieve equity through very small measures is just unrealistic. And again, it's going to require political courage. There's going to be tremendous pushback, just like there was when it came time to desegregate the schools. There was a tremendous pushback against that. But if we're going to be serious about it, if we don't want to still be having this conversation another, 1-2 generations, 50 years from now, that's what we have to do. It's going to be hard work. And it's going to require changing the ways that we have been living up until this point.
So we're going to go to Q&A, but I do want to follow up on this a little bit and stay with this discussion. And maybe one or two of the panelists can respond very quickly to this. You know, there's conversations in Connecticut taking place right now regarding racial segregation, and the goal, though, is to move beyond that and build more diverse communities. But just like the Hands Off schools, there's a group called Hands Off Our Zoning. And recently at a public meeting, a zoning official shared a comment around affordable housing, that affordable housing is paramount to ghettotizing the community. We talked about local control. Is there a role for state and federal leaders to play in getting engaged in this kind of issue? And Tim, I'm gonna start with you since you unmuted, because I'm like Betsy. I mean, when our home rule is what, and local control is what we stand for.
Yeah.
But what's now if we can't get consistent policy?
Just so y'all know, I unmuted not as a way to say call on me. I just knew I'd forget if I didn't do that, so I wasn't trying to do that. Let me say this. You know, I live in, as I said, I live in Nashville, and we're a really good example of a community where, you know, everybody loves Nashville all of a sudden. All the bachelorette parties are here. Folks are coming here to get on a pedal tavern and drink while they exercise. I don't understand any of that, but whatever it is, Nashville's like the place to be. Well, one of the problems with being the place to be is an increase in unaffordable housing, right? And part of what ends up happening is if you're a young person that wants to come here, I don't care, black, white, or otherwise, and you want to come to Nashville to take advantage of job opportunities or educational opportunities, we've got a lot of great universities here. You're going to find yourself likely living 30 minutes outside of the city because you're not going to be able to find a place to live. Now, is that a sustainable model for this city over time? I mean, look, my wife and I got in the housing market at a time when it was low, so we're doing fine. Thank you very much. But is that sustainable for everybody else? Absolutely not. That's not good for my kids. If they want to come back here after college, right? I got a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old. Are they going to be able to plant down stakes here? Probably not. We have a city, and this is an example of the zoning issue. Here in Nashville, we have a rule that says for every new unit of housing that's like condo or apartment unit, and there's a ton of them right now, they're building them on every block, like 40% of the cranes that are in use right now in the United States, according to one report that I saw, are being used here, which is insanity to me. But if you have a unit of condo or apartment housing that's constructed, for every one of those, you have to have 2 parking spots. Now, ask yourself, what's the effect of that rule, right? Number one, it encourages over-reliance on automobiles, which has effects environmentally. It has effects in terms of gridlock on the interstates and road rage and all kinds of problems, right? But the other problem is you're taking land out of circulation that could be used for people to live on, right? In other words, if I'm having to have 2 spots to park my cars for every place that you create that some people can live, that's less places for people to live. That jacks up the prices for everybody, right? And not just poor folks and not just folks of color, but solidly upper working, lower middle, and even upper middle. It makes it impossible for anyone except for the very wealthy. I mean, San Francisco, look at San Francisco right now. That is not a sustainable economic model. And everybody knows it, right? That you can't just have a bunch of tech bros living in the middle of San Francisco and busing out to Silicon Valley, right? And then coming back to their places where they're paying $3,000 for a walk-in closet to live in and say that that's sustainable, but oh, well, you know, a handful of people are doing fine and we don't want affordable housing because that's going to ghettoize the community. A lot of folks living in some rich ghettos right now. And by that, I mean places where life does not happen that is sustainable, right? Whether we're talking about the ghettos of Europe that folks were living in who were, you know, quote unquote white by today's standards, or whether we're talking about those places that we call ghettos now that Black and brown folks live in that are unsustainable and unhealthy. There are plenty of those where there's plenty of money, but they're not sustainable. So it isn't Black folks that are, or poor folks that quote unquote ghettoize a community. It's a mentality that says that we're going to go with policies and procedures that are not sustainable because it's working for this little group right over here. Might be working for that group right now, but I guarantee you over the long haul, that's not going to work for anyone. And so I think the state needs to take action. Now, the problem is, you know, here in Tennessee, we have a state legislature that is, you know, overwhelmingly right wing, and they have overruled everything we've tried to do in this town to create sustainable, affordable housing or living wages. Every time the city of Nashville passes an ordinance that's progressive, the state says you can't do that. So I realize that some states are up against that, especially those that have like these right-wing supermajorities. But in the state of Connecticut, there really ought to be no excuse for local government, because y'all pride yourself on how liberal you are. That's what you tell us down here. You know, y'all won the war, so y'all are the liberals. That you can easily take care of this problem. Supposedly, well, local government and state government in a place like Connecticut ought to be able to cooperate on creating it's not whether it's affordable. Sometimes the term affordable housing makes people think cheap and low cost. Sustainable housing, sustainable education, sustainable law enforcement, sustainable public health. Inequality is not sustainable for the vast majority of people, unless you're at the very, very if you're in the top 1/10, 1/100th of 1%, maybe, you know, you can build a gate around your community and you're good to go. But the rest of including the vast majority of white folks, the vast majority of upper middle class folks, promise you, wait 10 years, you'll have plenty of equity in your house, but you won't have anybody able to fill the jobs that are needed in your community. You won't have, you know, the traffic will just get worse because folks are going to have to commute 30 minutes away, and that's going to make your day much more miserable. Like this is just not healthy for anyone in the long run. I think that's the mentality that we have to bring to the conversation.
Those are very good comments. And one more comment, and then I'm going to this question board. Anybody addition to that? If not,
can I just say real quick? I mean, what is the word ghetto? I mean, let's examine what that is. That is a word of Italian origin. It means a part of a city that has been engineered to force a minority group into. I mean, it was originally in Italy where the Jews were forced to live, right? So when we even acknowledge that there's such a thing as a ghetto, we're talking about there's a section of the city that we use to force poor people, to force minorities, to force the marginalized to live in. And again, it's all entirely engineered through zoning. I mean, you can go back and you can look at the, you know, in many cities, it was in the beginning of the 20th century when they did redlining. And it was, you know, it was determined where Black people, where poor people were going to be concentrated within the city. And over decades and generations, those areas are denied access to wealth, denied access to public services. And then we turn around and we have this conversation as though we are doing some kind of charitable act by, you know, allocating some small amount of money for the people who have been living in those conditions for decades to have some kind of decent quality of life. You know, so again, this is not something that's just happenstance. This is something that is engineered through policy, and it can only be addressed through deliberate policy.
Thank you. Let me just say one thing. When we got to the schools issues, and the housing issues, the chat box lit up. And it's very obvious that this is an ongoing issue in the state. And I'm sure it's going to continue to be one of those issues. One of the questions stated, so much of this discussion conflates race and class. How do we deal with issues of poverty and class and persuade poor whites that this is in their interest? Who wants to start?
I can say something real quick about it.
Okay.
And actually, I promise, I'm not known for saying stuff quickly, but I will.
I'll help you.
The reason, yeah, I know you will. The reason that poor white folks ought to see it in their interest is the reason there are so many poor folks who are white in this country is because there are such a disproportionate number of Black and brown folks who are. In other words, white suffering is directly linked to Black and brown suffering. If you think about poverty, for instance, we have racialized poverty, right, in the last half century, to where when we talk about poor folks, we tend to not even think about the white poor. We tend to think about Black and brown poor folks. As a result, the research says we are more likely to cut social safety net programs, the programs that all poor people need, the programs that all working class people need. So white folks who are suffering because of the neglect that we bring to the table as a result of the racialization of social policy, right? So if I'm a working class struggling white person, I need Black and brown folks to do better so that I can do better, so that we can all do better. If they don't, right? In other words, if Black lives don't matter, my life is not going to matter. If Black suffering is not registering, then my suffering will not be registering. I'll be totally off the map altogether. So the solidarity is not about, as Bree has said and others have said, not about charity. This is about a recognition that when white folks are suffering, and this is true with police violence too, folks always say, well, you know, there are more white people killed by police. And is that a rebuttal to the problem of racial violence against Black folks? The fact that white folks are also getting shot. White Americans are getting shot by cops a lot more than white people anywhere else on the planet. Why? Because we've allowed the racialization of law enforcement to allow us to accept a level of violence from the state that we would not accept otherwise. And sometimes it affects us too. The same is true with economics, jobs, education, healthcare, every other area.
Any other thoughts?
Just simply to echo exactly what Tim said. Again, when you look at the numbers, actually, not both on really on an absolute basis, about who on an absolute basis who's living in poverty, living under this scourge of poverty. And first, I want to actually second something that was said earlier as well too. This idea of poor people and this moniker that in its title that's given to people as if it's a birthright. And as if it's not a system that individuals were born into and continue to feel under the weight under. It's the same, it actually goes back to, as Bree was saying, it's the same, conversation you have about, a slave, that these are people who existed in a system. And so that language that we're using around it does matter. But you were absolutely right. When you're looking at what Tim was saying, when we're looking at the different policies and pieces that we have in place, we know that there are policies that have been put in place that are putting people and keeping people in poverty. Now, we know the disproportionate numbers when it comes to race and how you have this interconnectedness. But the reality is that if you take a look at the child tax credit as just one small example, right? Part of the reason that the child tax credit starts feeling like a very cruel joke to people is on this idea of the fact that 54% of Black children, and by the way, 39% of white children do not qualify for it. They do not qualify for it because they don't hit the income threshold. And so you're talking about a policy that was put into place to support families and children who are below poverty line, but they are actually too deep into poverty to qualify for a policy that was supposed to be put in place towards to benefit them. The ridiculousness of how these things are actually put into place and how they're actually implemented should be not just frustrating to all of us who are willing to be honest and look at it, but truthfully, to Tim's point, we are going to have a disproportionate number when it comes to the way that it is impacting Black children and Latino children. But the reality is, when you are still talking about almost half of white children who are also not benefiting from this policy, this is your issue too. This is not just the issue of one group. How we think about everything from adjustments to CTC, baby bonds, all these other elements that we know actually will statistically increase elements of economic mobility for children. We know that it is going to have an impact on all of us, all of us, because the impacts of poverty are sitting on all of us.
So if I could just say real quick, I really don't think you can separate race and class in America. And that's part of the challenge, because there is material benefit in whiteness. Again, it exists through policies. And that's part of the challenge of deconstructing race as a system. It was stated earlier how a white man with a criminal record has, or I think it was a white man who has who has a criminal record, I believe, has a better chance of getting a job than a Black man who has no criminal record, or a white high school dropout earns about the same amount as a Black person with a college degree. So when you look at it from that perspective, I kind of challenge in some ways this idea that impoverished white people are acting solely against their best interests when they decide to side with white supremacy. I think that they are making certain calculations in terms of, what economic challenges or competition will increase if you were to do away with racism. But I think that the only way that we can get over that challenge is to address both at once. I think you have to both eliminate the race class hierarchy, and you also have to address poverty at the same time. I don't think that there's any other way to meet that challenge, so that those two things are no longer in competition with each other, because it seems to be that oftentimes people have this perception, again, that if you are doing something to address racism, then am I going to be left in the lurch, right? And so we have to figure out a way to do both at the same time, so nobody feels left behind.
So Betsy, I'm going to give you this question to just get your reaction. There is a comment in the chat and I'm reading this verbatim. We do have brown people moving into those rural areas because the schools are better and the rents are the same. Thus, our quote poor are really paraprofessionals and people in service areas. They are nursing aides and shift managers at Walmart. No matter what the color, but they are able to cling to being white as a way to feel better. How do you react to that?
I think there's two things happening in there. One, just noting that, a lot of people of color are trying to move to places they can afford to live, but also noting that there are a lot of white people who cling to being white. And I think that's part of the overall question here is, if you look at Jonathan Metzl's book, Dying of Whiteness, he really takes a deep dive in 3 different policy areas and on the ground around the country, and really shows that regardless, that white life expectancy would be longer under certain policies. If we had rational gun laws, if there were, the Affordable Care Act, and education in Kansas, he looks at education, all 3 of those, if we had different policies, white life expectancy was shortened by the policies in those states. But white people supported those, and he makes the case that it's because they're clinging to being white, that they would rather oppose the Affordable Care Act than be lumped in with all the Black and brown people who need the Affordable Care, who, they need it and we don't. They'd rather, we sacrifice a great deal as white people in the name of race on all ends of the spectrum. But the question I would ask, we, a lot of times, we white middle class liberals like to look at poor white people and say, oh my gosh, how can we get them to get on board with anti-racist policy when we are not on board with anti-racist policy? And looking at the bad other white, or the white that we pity, is a way of avoiding what's going on with us and among us. And so the question I would, for whoever asked that question, there have been really great answers. And it's a really great question about how whiteness plays itself out on the right versus the left, how it plays itself out among people who are in poverty versus middle-class people. But if you are a white middle-class liberal, we are one of the things in most cities standing in the way of anti-racist policy change. Our objections are the ones that are determining whether or not some policies move forward, in part because we situationally, we have, by our class status, as well as our whiteness, more power. And we use that power to object to changes in schools, to object to changes in zoning, to object to changes in policing. We're the ones showing up, and we're never going to say, oh, we don't want people of color to do well. What we do say is this is bad for a million different reasons. but all of them come down to us. And so we have to take a look at ourselves and our own investment in our own whiteness and our own investment in the systems the way that they are currently situated, and say, where can we learn to open our hearts and our minds to understand that these policies are actually bad for us and our children, that our community would be better off, that we would be better off in a world where everybody was doing well, where there wasn't racism, where our systems weren't based on our whiteness, but were instead based on our community doing well and our community thriving, including people of color and indigenous people. And so the invitation is to look at, whenever we're pulled to point to poor white people or to point to conservative white people if we're on the left, or liberal people if we're on the right, where we are pulled to make some distinction that there's bad white people are making these bad racist outcomes and we are good white people not contributing to them, when it's whiteness as a system, wherever it finds itself, that is creating these outcomes. And so thinking about how whiteness is playing through in the system, that's where the money's at. That's where you're going to get some real change for your community in a way that uplifts everyone.
Wow, that's a great way to end. I can say thank you all so much for this opportunity, Betsy. Great speaking and working with you again. Tim, always learned so much. And Wes, I'm telling you, the work that you're doing is just amazing. And we just value that. And Bree, I hope to get a chance to talk to you again. The National League of Cities is always looking to partner with great people that are doing good work. Joe, you really are lifting up a conversation that needs to be had in Connecticut. And actually, of all the state municipal leagues, and I don't know if the Connecticut leaders recognize that he is in fact a leader, not only in this work, but all over America, even pushing us to deal with the digital divide and the inequities that exist there. You know, we have an opportunity here. This is a start of a conversation. It's a start of a journey, and we don't have all that time that Mr. Baldwin talked about at the beginning. I don't think any of us want to have this conversation 3 to 5 years from now and still be saying these same things just because we see 8 minutes and 46 seconds. We see a white woman in Central Park accuse a Black man of something that he did not do, and bringing back all of those memories as a Black man in America and being uncomfortable. But the conversations are part of bridging the divide, creating knowledge, but action and engagement, no matter whether it's Black Lives Matter or any other group in America, deserves to be heard in a respectful way. And I know CCM is doing that. Joe, I know you and your team are committed to that. But I also, you know, when I asked that last question, Betsy, I really read it differently. And I got to tell you, I cling every day to enjoy my Blackness and not trying to achieve the white lifestyle. I want to be able to be comfortable with who I am, which I am, and be able to get the same things out of every city and town like everybody else in Connecticut, Washington, D.C., Minneapolis, New York, anywhere in North Carolina, Nashville. I want a house. I want to be able to have education. I want a great job, and I want to be measured by who I am and what I have to contribute. And we're not there yet. And I can say that each of you, I can tell, are committed to continuing to push us to get there. And to make sure that not only are we participating and paying taxes and assessments and all of those things, but the economics of the city. We should have Black businesses women-owned businesses, Hispanic-owned businesses be able to participate economically in America. And I cling to that, and I cling to being Black. And I celebrate that every day and proud of that. So I hope that the conversation that we have had today really sticks with the leadership of CCM and really start dealing with the structure, the systems, and make sure that we don't have the same conversation, that the next conversation is a lot more strategic and focused. Thank you all very much. And Joe, are you coming back to say goodbye to us?
I'm just coming back to again thank everybody. I want to point out that Clarence, it's evident that you are a former mayor. For in the middle of this panel to lose power and to lose internet, yet you did not miss a beat. You figured out a way to handle it quickly and deal with it and came right back on with us. That is definitely a municipal leader skill right there of dealing with ever-changing times.
This is helping me right now. The lights are still out, guys. And I paid my bill, so don't think I got money. I got money.
But the last comment that I want to make very quickly, a couple things. One, I also want to thank the CCM Board of Directors. It is under President Mike Frieda's guidance and my board that we are able to engage in these very important and very meaningful and incredibly needed dialogues. So I want to give kudos to our Board of Directors for that. And a big thanks to all of you again for joining us today. This is such an important conversation. Hopefully it's not the end, but the beginning of meaningful work that we can do here in Connecticut. So I hope everybody has a wonderful evening. That's all we have for today. But again, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Joe. Great job. Thank you all.
Thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome. Thank you, Leon.
Thanks, everybody. Great job.
Yes, thanks, everybody. Great job. Thank you, Leon.
Yeah, you too, Ron.
Great job, Betsy.